Hey friends, once again, I'm so glad that you're worshiping with us here at Common Grace as we continue this series, Short Stories with Jesus, looking at Jesus' parables and what they mean for us today. Our parable today is just one verse long, and I would invite you to hear this. This is from Matthew's 13th chapter, verse 33. It comes right after what we read last week about the mustard plant. I like to call this one the parable of the kingdom's banquet. Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So I don't know about you, and this is a familiar parable, but I read that 3 measures, and to be honest, I've always kind of thought that was more or less like 3 cups. So we could just sort of take it and it was like that. I'm not a very good baker, so I'm not very precise in this, but maybe some more there and some more there. So I kind of always imagined that this woman who's baking is working with something like this. And what I learned recently is that that's actually not true. It's more like, well, it's more than this even. In fact, it's more than 2 of these. And 3 of these, it would actually be equivalent to about 4 of these bags full of flour that she's using. It's about 60 pounds of flour is what she's working with. And that is very, very interesting to me. Because all of a sudden, if I were to bring out 60 pounds of flour and spread it out and just watch it all poof up, all of a sudden, we're talking about a different sort of thing than what I've ever imagined before. I want you to think with me back to last week. Remember, we talked about the mustard plant. And we said that the tiny thing, the mustard plant, grows into a bush. And calling it a tree is a little bit generous, to say the least, or comical. One commentator likened it to the story of the old pencil drawing, maybe you've seen it, of a farmer who has a gargantuan tomato sitting on the back of his flatbed truck that like takes up the whole flatbed of the truck. Think about the largest pumpkin you've ever seen, except it's a tomato. It's comical. It couldn't happen. It's farcical. It's not intended to be taken like reality. It's ridiculous, it's funny, it's memorable, but it's unrealistic. The picture this week is the same. Here is this woman with 60 pounds of flour, far more than one woman could knead all by herself. And the bread that it would yield, it would feed a large group for a long amount of time. This was a massive quantity. More than even what would be used in a professional setting, at least by one person. It's hyperbolic, it's comical, it's extravagant. The same commentator that I referenced earlier, Eugene Boring, he says that this image of this woman is an image of a woman who has either lost her mind or is working in the kingdom's bakery. I love that imagery. I love that name. It's all meant to be a little bit silly, a little bit hyperbolic. It's meant to give us an image that sticks with us. This builds on something that I said last week. Remember, we talked about how Jesus will often use everyday things, everyday objects or realities or transactions in the midst of the parables in order to help people understand things that they can less wrap their minds around, like the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God or what salvation is about or mercy or justice or grace is about. That is true. But he'll also often add a very unexpected, surprising, or supernatural component to it. It's sort of like, very, very often, it's like this is happening and this is happening. If you said that there is a woman who is in her bakery, in her home baking, and she has some flour and she adds some yeast, all of that makes sense until you get to the 3 measures, 60 pounds of flour. It's all pretty straightforward except for that one little part. It's meant to stick with the audience. It's meant to shock. It's meant to engage the listener and give a more vivid image for them to hold on to. In the extravagance, I think we get a glimpse of what Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like. I think that's a part of the parable. I think that's a part of the purpose that in this image of a woman with 60 pounds of flour, 4 of these we get an image of just how extravagant God's love is, of just how generous and excessive the kingdom is. It's overwhelming. The kingdom of heaven is lavishing grace and love on us. God's reign of mercy is abundant and abounding and over the top. So here's this woman with this image of 60 pounds of flour laid out on a table. It's too much. It's overflowing. And friends, right here at the beginning, I think that's one of the things that we're supposed to get out of this. I wonder if some of us just need to sit with this image. I mean, maybe the next time you go to Costco or Sam's or a big box store, maybe just even at Hy-Vee or Hen House or wherever you do your shopping, just put 60 pounds of flour in your cart. Just look at it and imagine it all out of the bag, all out of control. Just look at it until it makes you giggle, because it should. I wonder if some of us just need to sit with that image this week. We who are prone to feelings of scarcity, like we'll never have enough, like we need to hold on tightly. We who are prone to feel limited, as if we're boxed in, as if there's not enough to go around. We who sometimes wonder if there is enough grace and forgiveness and mercy in God for us and what we've done and what we've been through and the sins that we've committed and the wrong that we've experienced. Maybe we just need to sit with this image of dust flying, of this little lady. That's how I always picture her, as a little lady in the kitchen, joyously and haphazardly working with the flour as it spills over the table and she mixes the yeast into it. Maybe this week that's your invitation, is just to sit with that image and wrestle with how extravagantly gracious God's kingdom is for you and for me. Maybe there's another step. Maybe some of us need to throw our chef's hat on, to get our hands dirty, and to start living lives of extravagant generosity. Maybe that's where this parable hits you. You know, it's interesting because we have this celebration that we have coming up on March 3rd, on Friday, March 3rd in the evening, called Grace Extravaganza. And I'll tell you that I often think the work that this community has done in the way of mission here in Kansas City, across the nation, around the world is extravagant. And when we come together, we get to celebrate that. We get to lift that up, what God has done and what God is doing and what God will do in the year ahead. We get to contribute to that and be a part of it. And part of why it's such a joyous night is because there's so many wonderful and incredible things happening that we get to be a part of. Grace Extravaganza, I love that. God's love is extravagant. And we're invited to join in the generosity and the grace that God is just lavishing on the world, to be a small part of it. Maybe some of us need to put on our chef's hat, to get in the kitchen and to be a part of the extravagant work that God is doing in our lives, in our community, and all around us. This image, perhaps, should help us easily connect with God. This idea of extravagance. Jesus seems to be big on eating. This woman is preparing bread, presumably. Jesus also seems to be big on feeding. Presumably, she'll be sharing it with a lot of different people. We say each week in the prayer that Jesus taught that we ask that God would give us this day our daily bread. We pray in our communion liturgy when we share in that meal together that Jesus ate with sinners and that he fed the hungry. And at the end, we get a preview of this promise, of this heavenly banquet. It says, bind us together until Christ comes in final victory and we feast together at his heavenly banquet. It's a beautiful image of what is to come. We read about Jesus feeding the multitudes over and over again in the scriptures, and perhaps one of the closest images to what we see in this parable that Jesus teaches is the miracle of the wedding of Cana, where Jesus turns water into wine. This is the first of the 7 signs in John's gospel, and if you remember, he tells them to go fill up these cisterns. In essence, it's probably like 60 plus gallons of water that get turned into this fine wine. It's extravagant, it's excessive, it's unbelievable. These are huge. In one sermon, I called this bathtubs full of the finest wine. We see Jesus doing this all the time, specifically around meals. Jesus even calls himself the bread of life. So the idea that Jesus in a parable would use this image of extravagance shouldn't be shocking to us. But maybe it should surprise us enough to consider what it means for our lives. And maybe when we look at the way that Jesus offers extravagant meals and hospitality, we should also think about what it means for us to offer extravagant hospitality to other people. How it is that we welcome the outsider. How it is that we include people in our community. How it is that we reflect God's love and grace and mercy into the world, that others might experience God's goodness and relationship with God. We see this other places in the scriptures too. Amy Jill Levine draws a parallel between this and what happens in Genesis 18. This is a really cool story. In fact, maybe you want to read it this week. Genesis 18, Abraham is tired and weary and sitting out on a hot day, and he sees three strangers approach. And he goes and he bows down at their feet and he says, please come and stay with me and have a little bit of water and a little bit of food. And then he goes into the kitchen and he says to his wife, Sarah, he says, hey, bake up 3 measures of flour as a meal for these strangers. That little bit of bread just got really big. It's the same idea of this extravagant hospitality, and Abraham in himself will become a paradigm for hospitality because of that. He didn't just meet the standard that was set very high in that culture. He exceeded it. It was this idea of extravagance. And Abraham becomes known for that. And throughout the history of Christian and Jewish thought, he's been a paradigm that's looked at for that. In fact, many think that that's what the author of Hebrews is referring to in Hebrews chapter 13, where the author writes, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing so, some have entertained angels without knowing it. The image that we're getting today is an image consistent with who God is, a God of extravagant hospitality, a God of abounding grace. We see it in Jesus, who invites others to come and eat with him, who feeds 5,000 and has baskets full left over, who turns massive amounts of water into wine. Maybe for some of us this day, what we simply need to reflect on is God's extravagant grace and mercy, and how we get to put our chef's hat on, get into the kitchen, and be a part of it. The more and more I thought about this parable, this one verse, the more and more I thought about the woman and her flour and her little bit of leaven or yeast and the call to hospitality, the more and more I imagined it, the more I had this comical, delightful, beautifully disarming way of seeing it. I just want you to see the woman. I mean, like looking at that 60 pounds of flour in the grocery store. I just want you to see her. What does that look like for you? What does she look like? If you could, I just want you to see in your mind's eye her smiling and bouncing as she mixes her ingredients. See if you can smell the flour and the yeast and the coals warming by the oven. See if you can hear her laughing and humming to herself as she clanks her bowls and her spoons. See if you can imagine her skin and her hair all caked in the white of flour dust. She has to me this look and this feel of a delightful, charming, joyously mad baker. Just a little bit off, fully aware of how ridiculous this must look to anybody seeing it from the outside. And if you have that image, what is it that motivates her? What is it that causes her to do that? I think the answer is simple. It's love. The kingdom of heaven is always about love. So I thought of this woman and I was trying to think of parallels and where I've seen it is, what does it look like? The first image that came to mind was from the live action version of the movie The Grinch. I don't know if you remember this scene, but when the Grinch is in elementary school, he has a big crush on Martha May Whovier, and he wants to impress her, and it comes to Christmas time. And so the teacher has said that they can make gifts for one another to share. And so he goes goes home, and it has this beautiful, like 40-second scene where he dumps out silverware, where he breaks a record player, where he goes and gets family heirlooms, it says, to pull jewels out of it. And he makes this beautiful little handcrafted angel to give to her. It's this scene, and he has this delightful energy about him. No sense of the callous nature that will come as he just dives into making this little craft. Have you ever had that experience in your life? Something similar happened with me. We were about 100 days from getting married, I think, and I made this little calendar for Hope, this little countdown calendar, customized it, painted it, made out of blocks. Honestly, it's objectively not that impressive when you look at it now, when I look at it now, but it still sits on a shelf. And I spent a lot of time making it, sort of obsessing over all the little details. Have you done that in your life? With something? Maybe it was about preparing a meal for somebody. And maybe as you were preparing a meal for somebody or baking a cake or doing something like that for some special occasion, you found that it was getting more and more complicated and it was taking more and more time than you thought. Maybe you did it as a child when you wanted to color something for a parent or a loved one, a loved family member. But have you ever noticed that as these get more complicated and as they take more time, it's okay? Those are the things that I'm talking about where you get lost in it and you think this is going to be so fun and you're willing to spend time. It doesn't even feel like it's work. It just feels like you're doing something fun. You want to make every small detail perfect. And why do we do this? We do it for love. Because we have these ways that by proxy, we want to express our affection and our care to other people. We do this in all sorts of ways, big and small. I bet you can think about one. Maybe it was this Valentine's Day or a previous Valentine's Day. Maybe it was done for a child or a friend. Maybe you did it before somebody's wedding. You wanted them to have the perfect shower, the perfect bachelor party, the perfect trip, the perfect whatever. We get these small creative opportunities and we invest so much energy, and it's motivated by love. And when it has the right element of surprise, man, that adds all the more to it. I'm going to do all of this and they're not even going to know what's coming, but they're going to love it. That's the image that I get of this woman in her kitchen with all of this flour flying. She's willing to take as much time as it requires, and she's got this delightful grin, this levity about her as she bounces in the kitchen in order to make all of this bread leavened so that she can share this with whoever will receive. There is this joyfully mischievous and subversive element to it because she knows what she's doing and why she's doing it. But those who will receive it, to them it's still yet a perfect surprise. And maybe that's part of the message of our parable. The kingdom of heaven is at work behind the scenes in this joyful, light way, often imperceptibly, to bring about healing and growth and strength and courage to face the day. And here it likens to another thing altogether that I think we could focus on in this parable. What is it that's working? After she's all done, what happens? All the yeast has been incorporated, and then the yeast gets to do its work. And so maybe in the beautiful extravagance, maybe in the love-filled planning and work, maybe that's where you find yourself in this story. Or maybe we could reflect on what it is that the yeast is and does and what it represents. Just a little bit goes a long way, sort of like we read last week. But how does leaven work? How does yeast work? A small, almost unnoticeable amount gets put into pounds and pounds and pounds of flour, and then you set it aside in a warm place, in a dark place, to allow it to work. I remember watching Hope day after day after day, month after month after month, feed her sourdough starter. I said it was like her practice child before Gracie got here. And you put it in different places depending on how much you want it to grow and expand, and let the yeast do its work. Here are some things about that process. First of all, you can't see it happen for a couple of reasons. Number one, oftentimes it needs to happen in a place that's dark. Secondly, because it often happens slowly. You can see maybe 1 hour to the next, 1 day to the next for sure, but you probably wouldn't just sit and watch it happen. Perhaps the kingdom of heaven, perhaps God's reign of mercy and forgiveness works like that a little bit. It works slower than oftentimes we want, slower than oftentimes we can perceive. But yet if we take stock and reflect in ourselves and on the world, perhaps we would find it. The second thing that I want to say about that process is you can't control it. You can control some of the context for it. You can create a space where it's more likely or less likely to happen. But when you put the yeast in to do its work, you don't get to control it anymore. The yeast just simply does what it does. At some point, friends, we have to let go and trust that God is on the move. At some point, we can't control every aspect of our own lives. And maybe a part of the kingdom of heaven is learning to let go and to trust that God is indeed at work. Here's the third thing. Over time, it will grow and it will expand. And sometimes, before you even realize it, it's time, it's ready. It's possible to move on to something new. I think this happens in our lives a lot, that God often works in ways that we don't perceive or recognize, and all of a sudden some change happens and we realize, wait a minute, I'm much more prepared for this than I thought. Or we look back on our relationships or our career or something and we say to ourselves, you know what? I have been prepared for this in ways that I never would have anticipated. And we figure out, we find out, we discover and uncover what the next most faithful step is going to be. Sometimes God is at work within us in ways that we didn't even know. And it's only when we look back that we see it. Here's the last thing. You may not watch the yeast do its work in the midst of the flour and the dough that's made, but you can trust it's happening, and I think that's true for the kingdom of heaven as well. God continues to be at work. I think all of those are similar to how the kingdom of heaven works now. So in his book that I'm encouraging you to read through this Lenten season, John Indermark talks about how he became a writer. He was a pastor, and now he's a full-time writer. And he goes into detail. He says, I can point back to moments. I can think back to elementary school and junior high and high school when I was encouraged by teachers and when I was learning things and drawn to things and paying attention to things that I never thought that I would use. And he talks about how as a pastor you have to preach every week, and it turns out that Sunday does come with a significant amount of regularity, and that prepared him in ways that he hadn't anticipated. But he said, I can point to some touchstones, some moments, but I can't tell you the moment that I became a writer. It was just something that grew over time. And here's what he says. The same thing is true for you and I. Each of us in our lives, it's not one thing that we can point to. It's a process that often happens slowly and maybe even begins imperceptibly. So I wonder, if someone were to ask you, how did you become a person of faith? What would you respond? If your story might be the same thing. Or if somebody asked you how you developed a particular skill or a particular career or proficiency at a career, if you might say the same thing, there was some moments, but I'm not sure. It just kind of happened. Or when did you become a person of peace or patience? Or how did you grow in your manifestation of the fruit of the Spirit? There would be touch points, small stories that we could tell. But my guess is after we ran out of those stories, we would finally just have to conclude, after we laid it all out there, that like the rising of the dough, it simply came with time. The God working to bring about the kingdom of heaven did just what God does, sometimes slowly and imperceptibly, but prepared and worked in us for something yet unknown. Maybe you realize one day, years into a job, that you'd been prepared for the next step, next stage, new career. Maybe you realize one day as a parent, wide-eyed and anxious, that you were more prepared for the task at hand than you actually thought that you were. And maybe that was a good counter to all the times where you thought you had no idea what you were doing. Maybe you realized one day in the midst of an unexpected loss of a loved one, a parent, an aunt, an uncle, a grandparent, that you were holding on to something that had strengthened you in the weeks ahead and perhaps prepared you to face this moment of grief in ways that you wouldn't have been otherwise ready to. And it's not only about what has been, but what will be. And Remark says this, I think this is beautiful. I say without fear of contradiction that God has been and continues to work in hidden ways to bring renewal to your life. You may already perceive some of those ways, some still await your discovery. Grace continues to leaven who we are with the possibility of what we may yet be. We may be unable to put our finger on it or to define it or to say that's it, but we may trust God's ever-present, unseen influence in our lives. So perhaps the kingdom of heaven is preparing for us for something and we don't perceive it yet. Perhaps we could benefit from looking back on our life of faith and considering the ways that we were shaped and the ones who influenced us. Often enough, perhaps going unnoticed in the time, and think about how they've made you who you are today. And maybe we should remind ourselves, even now, that we might be in the process of being prepared for something yet unknown. And perhaps we're invited to consider how God's work within us might be making a way to some unknown, beautiful future. Friends, there's so much we can find in this story of the Kingdom Bakery, of this woman just going about her work with joy and levity, 60 pounds of flour, yeast and all, aware of something. Perhaps the kingdom of heaven is like that after all. Let's take a few moments for reflection.